September 21st, 1947. Dalton Trumbo and his family were now living on a remote ranch 2 hours north of Los Angeles. You could go for days without seeing a car on the road nearby. So, on this Sunday, when a black sedan appeared on the horizon, it was particularly unusual. Nikki and Christopher, two of Trumbo's 3 children, were out playing in the yard when the car arrived. The man inside was a U.S. Marshal. The marshal asked the children if their folks were around, and the kids let him into the house. They found Dalton Trumbo in the kitchen, where the marshal handed him an envelope. He opened it in front of everybody. Inside was a pink slip of paper telling him that he'd been summoned to Washington to appear before the Un-American Activities Committee of the House of Representatives of the United States.
Hello?
Across town that very same day, Charlie Chaplin got a phone call from the U.S. Marshal. He too had a pink slip on the way, summoning him to Washington. 43 people that day received congressional subpoenas. The House of Representatives wanted answers, but even more than that, they wanted to put on a show. And some of the brightest stars in Hollywood would attract the kind of attention they were looking for. More and more Americans were seeing communism as a threat to the United States. Politicians wanted to be seen to be doing something about it. And this is where Hollywood and Washington come together: politics and showbiz. From the BBC World Service and CBC podcasts, I'm Oona Chaplin, and this is Hollywood Exiles. Episode 6, Hollywood on Trial. Of the 43 people summoned to Washington, 19 were immediately labeled hostile to the committee by the Hollywood trade press. My grandfather, Charlie Chaplin, was one of those 19. Unlike most of the others, he was not a U.S. citizen. He'd lived in the country for nearly 30 years, but never saw the need to tie himself to a particular nation. This would become a big problem for him. So, why were those 19 witnesses, the ones labeled hostile, called to testify? Why them and nobody else? 6 months before the subpoenas were handed down from Congress, there was another set of hearings of the House Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC.
Meeting will come to order. This committee, under its mandate from the House of Representatives, has the responsibility of exposing and spotlighting subversive elements wherever they may exist.
The committee had a long history. Ever since the Russian Revolution of 1917, American politicians had worried about communism. Over the years, they created committees and launched investigations that never amounted to much. But in 1945, HUAC was made a permanent committee with stable funding and committed resources. It would eventually dig into every corner of American life in pursuit of alleged infiltrators.
It is only to be expected that such elements would strive desperately to gain entry to the motion picture industry, simply because the industry offers such a tremendous weapon for education and propaganda.
But under the leadership of Chairman J. Parnell Thomas, HUAC was first going to take on Hollywood.
Movies are perceived to have such a great influence over public opinion.
This is Larry Ceplair, author of The Inquisition in Hollywood.
It was instant publicity. People loved the movies. They loved the movie stars. So if you went after Hollywood and could sort of expose some of these people, it was instant publicity. Headlines all the time.
And so Hollywood seemed like the best place for HUAC to start. Of course, there was one man who was well ahead of them.
The Communist Party of the United States is a fifth column, if there ever was one. It is far better organized than were the Nazis in occupied countries prior to their capitulation.
J. Edgar Hoover, head of the FBI, had investigated my grandfather as a possible communist as early as 1922. So when HUAC opened its investigations into Hollywood 25 years later, it wanted to start with somebody who'd be supportive to their cause. This audio is from the hearing of March 1947, 6 months before the subpoenas were handed down.
They are seeking to weaken America, just as they did in their era of obstruction when they were aligned with the Nazis. Their goal is the overthrow of our government.
Hoover needed the committee. He saw the role of the FBI as a fact-finding institution. It built cases quietly and in secret. HUAC's role, he told them, was to expose the communist threat to the nation. Larry Ceplair.
Which was important for the Red Scare. You wanted to have this publicized. You wanted people to be frightened.
And what better way of attracting attention than calling one of the most famous faces in Hollywood history, Charlie Chaplin?
Thank you for all of us. Tonight, in the minds of every thinking American, lurks the thought of danger to our country. We pray for inspired leadership needed to beat back the commie threat.
Generating publicity around the early hearings wasn't a problem at all. Hedda Hopper, the fierce anti-communist pro-Hoover columnist and radio host, saw to it gladly.
Tonight, let's pray for a rebirth in today's leadership of the great spirit of Washington, the spirit that puts country above self-interest, that puts duty ahead of just pleasing people. Then America will again be blessed with the consecrated leadership which has and will again protect and preserve our God-given heritage of freedom.
Jennifer Frost is Hopper's biographer.
I think she painted a broad brushstroke, but she definitely, she was anti-government, right? Or anti-big government, as she would call it.
There is no evidence that Chaplin was ever a member of the Communist Party. He had friends who were, and his political beliefs could be seen to lean left, but that was enough evidence for Hopper, so Charlie bore the brunt of Hopper's columns and radio shows.
Any kind of programs or policies to, intervene in the economy or help people with social welfare, she was against all of that. And that we would see that as sort of social democratic, right? We wouldn't even call Social Security socialist. If you're being careful in your ideology, you wouldn't even really say that. You would say it was social democratic. But all these kinds of policies she would call communist. She would conflate socialism and communism.
Hoover and Hopper had plenty of powerful allies in the industry, but there were others in Hollywood who were alarmed by what was starting to feel like a witch hunt. Some of them were willing to speak out.
Today, the Un-American Activities Committee is engaged in a smearing campaign of the motion picture industry.
Katherine Hepburn was one of Hollywood's most respected and prolific actors for 6 decades. Movies like The African Queen, The Lion in Winter, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, and On Golden Pond. If you haven't heard of these movies, look them up. You won't regret it.
And today, we won't turn the clock back, and we won't stand still. We'll move forward, progressively forward.
On May 19, 1947, artists in Hollywood gathered at the Gilmore Stadium to rally to the cause of their colleagues. What Hepburn and her fellow speakers were really angry about was an attack on free speech.
I want to speak about the attack on culture, not because I work in the field of culture. I speak because I am an American, and as an American, I shall always resist any attempt at the abridgment of freedom.
Freedom. That very same word Hedda Hopper uses. All sides of the argument are so keen to protect it. In her speech, Hepburn directly calls out Hedda Hopper's allies in Hollywood. Battle lines were being drawn.
He is aided and abetted in this effort by a group of Hollywood super patriots who call themselves the Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals. For myself, I want no part of their ideals.
Despite her public status and despite making such a high-profile political speech, Katherine Hepburn was never summoned by Congress. It's strongly suspected, by the way, that Hepburn's words that night were written by Dalton Trumbo, who was indeed a member of the Communist Party. Trumbo was in the process of moving his family out of town. He'd bought a ranch to the north of Los Angeles, and he was eager to get there. The move was precipitated by warnings the FBI was investigating him and his family. Almost a year had passed since Billy Wilkerson had published his list of known communists in Hollywood, and it had put Dalton Trumbo front and center of the now very public debate around subversive activities in motion pictures. Trumbo was growing increasingly concerned and agitated. He was often heard ranting loudly into his phone about how it was being tapped. It felt like the walls were closing in. At this time, Dalton Trumbo was the editor of The Screenwriter, a newsletter for the Screenwriters Guild, the organization that was increasingly coming under fire for its radical membership and ideas. Trumbo's colleague proposed an American Authors Authority. Writers could be compelled to submit work to the authority, which would secure copyright and bargain with publishers and producers. They hoped that by collectivizing their labor, writers could be guaranteed shared prosperity. Trumbo enthusiastically embraced the idea in an editorial. This was met with hostility and anger from the political right. The influential Catholic News published an editorial in which they claimed that this new authority would throw the shadow of the Kremlin and the ghost of Goebbels across the typewriters and manuscripts of America. This was proof, it said, that communists and subversives were working among American screenwriters. Trumbo would later rebut the idea in another opinion piece. But because the newsletter he edited had published the idea, he wasn't surprised at all that a U.S. Marshal arrived at his door with a subpoena. Years later, Trumbo would say about that issue of The Screenwriter, "This volume probably did more to bring on the 1947 HUAC investigation than any other single circumstance." Behind the scenes, Hoover is growing increasingly concerned about the House Un-American Activities Committee. They had a public stage, and they wanted to put on a circus.
There's a long-standing tension between the FBI and the House Un-American Activities Committee.
Hoover has worked long and hard to help shape public perceptions of communists. It's why he worked with Hedda Hopper. He sees politicians in the committee as reckless, more interested in their own careers than in the greater good. This is John Sbardellati, author of J. Edgar Hoover Goes to the Movies.
The FBI feared that HUAC tarnished the anti-communist movement because it was so irresponsible. Hoover doesn't want anti-communism to be controversial, so anything that HUAC does that brings disrepute upon anti-communism is, from Hoover's perspective, dangerous.
To warn him against any disasters, Hoover needs a man on the inside.
So one of the things that he does is that he gets a former FBI agent, a man named H. Allen Smith, to be one of the investigators for HUAC. And essentially, Smith becomes Hoover's spy on the committee. Because Smith's first loyalties, even though his employer is now HUAC, he's still sort of reporting back to the FBI. And this is where Chaplin comes in.
1947 was a hot summer, and tensions were running high. The committee was putting together the list of people they wanted to subpoena in the fall and demanded information from the FBI. The FBI resented being treated like a library service. In the midst of this, H. Allen Smith was sending messages to Hoover, telling his boss he needed to worry about these hearings.
This is going to be a mess, this trial, because these guys are not taking this seriously. You're equipping us with the actual, evidence of who is and who's not a communist in Hollywood, but they're only concerned with going after the big names. They only want the headlines.
To be clear, Hoover wanted headlines, but he wanted the right kind of headlines. If the committee started calling people who weren't communists, who weren't actively party members, it could look like the committee was cracking down on free speech, one of the very founding principles of the United States, and exactly what Katherine Hepburn was warning about. That's not the narrative Hoover wanted. And the biggest red flag, pardon the pun, was that the committee wanted Charlie Chaplin to be their star witness. Now, Hoover had kept an eye on my grandfather for decades. He had helped orchestrate the case that landed him in court on charges under the White Slave Traffic Act. But when it came to Charlie's politics, Hoover knew that they just didn't have the goods.
The FBI is saying, no, don't include Chaplin here. We don't have evidence that he's a communist.
Monsieur Verdieu, you have been found guilty. Have you anything to say before sentence is passed upon you?
Charlie Chaplin was not a communist, but J. Edgar Hoover found something else to be troubled about. Right in the middle of all of this, Chaplin had released one of the most unusual films of his career. It was called Monsieur Verdieu. It's a strange tale, bear with me. It's a dark comedy and a satire reacting to the recent horrors of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. To support his disabled wife, Chaplin's Verdieu turns to the business of marrying and murdering wealthy widows.
So I was forced to go into business for myself. As for being a mass killer, does not the world encourage it? Is it not building weapons of destruction for the sole purpose of mass killing? Has it not blown unsuspecting women and little children to pieces, and done it very scientifically? As a mass killer, I'm an amateur by comparison.
I think it's a very radical film. It's a film that very much expressed a leftist position. It very much expressed a position that was common among communist artists and left-leaning artists in the mid to late 1940s. To my mind, that doesn't mean it's communist propaganda, and it certainly doesn't mean that someone who makes a film like that is necessarily themselves a communist, though we probably could technically classify him at that point as a communist sympathizer, or at the very least as someone who rejected anti-communism.
This was actually a movie communists in Hollywood tried to dissuade Chaplin from making. They didn't like the idea that the main character was a murderer. How does that help their image? But for the political right, this was further evidence of Chaplin's subversive tendencies, and the reaction was hostile from all sides. These are the words of Congressman John Rankin as read by an actor.
I am today demanding that the Attorney General institute proceedings to deport Charlie Chaplin.
There had always been rumblings about my grandfather's citizenship.
He has refused to become an American citizen. His very life in Hollywood is detrimental to the moral fabric of America.
And this particular congressman advocated banning Chaplin from the United States and boycotting his pictures.
In that way, he can be kept off the American screen, and his loathsome pictures can be kept from the eyes of the American youth. He should be deported and got rid of at once.
Politicians very openly questioned Chaplin's loyalty to the United States. Was he really one of them? Did he really belong here? These questions would continue to haunt him long after the Monsieur Verdoux publicity had died away.
But it's at this moment that the subpoenas are handed down from Washington. 43 in total. 19 were hostile or so-called unfriendly witnesses. And perhaps Trumbo and Chaplin were obvious people to call. But in fact, it wasn't clear why this particular 19 were called before anybody else.
No one is completely sure.
Larry Ceplair again.
3 of the 19 were not members of the party. They were progressives, liberals, but they weren't party members. It was all males. Most of them had not been war veterans. Some were very close friends. Some were not very friendly toward one another. They were different generations of people. So it was a kind of a mix of people without real rhyme or reason to it. A lot of hardcore communists weren't called. So it's hard to say, here's exactly what they were looking to get.
So the 19 were all men. The committee didn't want to be accused of attacking women. They didn't want to be seen as attacking war veterans either, even though there were plenty of them in the Hollywood Communist Party. The committee was careful about who it called. It didn't want bad publicity. But it wasn't careful enough for the FBI. Hoover was furious that Charlie Chaplin had been issued a subpoena, a fact that would soon become public knowledge. It sparked a frenzy. Newspapers wanted to know, was Charlie Chaplin going to testify in Washington, and what might he say?
My grandfather seemed to quite enjoy the attention, not least because it helped the publicity of Monsieur Verdoux, which was not performing very well at the box office. He spotted the opportunity for a stunt. He drafted a response to the House Unamerican Activities Committee. Here, it's read by an actor.
In order that you be completely up to date on my thinking, I suggest that you view carefully my latest production, Monsieur Verdoux. It's against war and the futile slaughter of our youth. I trust you will find its humane message distasteful.
This is Chaplin baiting the committee. And he goes further, opening Monsieur Verdoux in 5 Washington movie theaters so that as the committee drive to work on Capitol Hill in the morning, they see giant posters of Charlie Chaplin greeting them whichever way they turn. Separately, he sent each of the members of the committee an invitation to the gala screening, which none attended. In that same letter, he also made his position absolutely and unequivocally clear.
I am not a communist. I am a peacemonger.
The response from HUAC was swift and courteous. They told him that he would not be called to testify, after all. Hoover ultimately got his way, and Charlie Chaplin would consider the matter closed. For now. However, the matter was far from closed for the other hostile witnesses. For them, it was just beginning. In early October 1947, they each received confirmation that they would be called before the HUAC at the end of that month. Dalton Trumbo, alongside his colleagues, all of whom were members of the Communist Party, boarded a train from Los Angeles to Washington. They had good cause to be nervous. Their careers, their livelihoods, and their reputations were all on the line. But they were defiant, too. And none more so than Dalton Trumbo, because he had a plan. If Washington wanted a show, he'd give them a show.
Coming up on Hollywood Exiles.
I believe I have the right to be confronted with any evidence which supports this question. I should like to see what you have.
Oh, well, you would.
Yes.
Well, you will pretty soon.
Hollywood Exiles is a production of BBC Audio Wales for the BBC World Service and CBC Podcasts. I'm Oona Chaplin. Charlie Chaplin was voiced by Paul Ryan. Congressman John E. Rankin was voiced by Johnny Glynn.
HUAC hearings, recorded by Paramount Newsreels.
Our producers are Glynn Tansley and Megan Jones. Music by Phil Channel and sound design by Kathy Robinson and Phil Channel. Our theme is by Nick Thorburn. Executive producer for BBC Audio is Martin Smith. At the BBC World Service, Prabjit Bains is senior producer, and John Minnell is the podcast commissioning editor. At CBC Podcasts, Jeff Turner is senior producer. Chris Oak is executive producer, and Arif Noorani is the director. Thank you for listening.